Hello, everyone, and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter with Ray Fittipaldo. I'm here in Indianapolis. Ray is on his way, and this Monday we're getting you a preview for all the things about the Combine, the strengths, the weaknesses of all the different draft classes, who the Steelers should be looking at, and with Omar Khan set to talk Tuesday, what are the biggest questions facing him, all here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here joined by Ray Fittipaldo, one of our great Steelers beat writers. And as always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. This show today is brought to you, as always, by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in an accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injured victims for over 40 years recover more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one have been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, you'll be joining me here in Indianapolis shortly, but something that you wrote about and that we've talked about a lot for this draft class is the strength of its defensive tackles and how well that matches up with such a big need for the Steelers to get stronger up front. What you wrote about this weekend after looking closer at this year's class of that group, and what have you learned in your early research before we start talking to these guys at the Combine?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, you touched on it. It's really, really strong, and it's deep, and they come in all shapes and sizes. If the Steelers want to get a big run-stuffing nose tackle type in the first, second, or third round, they can do that. If they want to get a 3 technique to replace Larry Ogunjobi, they can do that. Mm-hmm. And if they want to get a 5 technique to replace Cam Heyward, they can do that too. Now, it seems to me when I look at it, the big interior run stuffers, I mean, there are a ton of guys, Chris, who are 320, 330, 340 pounds in this class. I wrote about one of them, Michigan's Kenneth Grant.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of others. Jamari Caldwell out of Oregon is one of those guys. Jordan Phillips out of Maryland is one of those guys. There's probably 3 or 4 more guys just like that. So it seems like those guys are aplenty. But, 3 techniques, 5 techniques as well. I mean, if the Steelers can't find a starter in this draft, there's something wrong. And I think given their circumstances, Chris, they might even be able to find 2. And I don't think anyone in that Steelers building would complain about that, given the age on that defensive line and given some of the declining play that we saw late in the season.
One of the things you and I talked about was the depth of the Steelers defensive line, or the lack of depth on the Steelers defensive line, and how deep the Eagles defensive line was in their Super Bowl win and their rotation. Imagine if you got 2 starting capable defensive tackles in this draft class, but you didn't have to use both of them as starters. You could get one early and one in the middle rounds, and then all of a sudden you have Keeanu, Benton, Cam Heyward, and 2 rookies as part of your rotation. And then say you get a Milton Williams or or another guy, Wharton, out of free agency, and then all of a sudden you have 4 or 5 guys that you're feeling really confident that, hey, these guys can be significant contributors up front, both against the run and against the pass. Yeah. I do agree that is a possibility to go after here. Daniel Jeremiah, as you wrote in your story on Kenneth Grant in this defensive tackle class, Daniel Jeremiah, NFL draft expert, says he thinks that there's 24 potential starting defensive tackles in this draft class. Right, that's a lot of people to pick through right now. But also, when you see that many talented guys in this draft class, the ones that are higher up usually end up being that much better, because that's when you don't have you're not just getting a guy who was just the best at his position because it was just a down year. You're getting guys that are the best of their position in really good years for that position, which means they're that much better than all these other guys who are potential starters in the NFL.
Yeah, and just to give our listeners some perspective out there, last year he only had 12 defensive tackles with starter grade or potential starter grade. So it's double what it was last year. Let's touch on, some of the guys that we're going to be hearing about in the coming weeks. Mason Grant, of course, from Michigan, probably a top 10 guy. I don't think, Chris, the Steelers are going to have a chance at him.
I agree.
He's probably the best defensive lineman in this class. But honestly, after Graham, there's a bunch of guys who are going to be, say, like 11 through 30. And I think the Steelers, if they want to trade up or if they want to sit tight, we'll have some opportunities. Guys like Walter Nolen out of Ole Miss, Derrick Harmon out of Oregon, Kenneth Grant, again, out of Michigan. And, one more thing about Grant, before we move on to some of these other guys, he's a ready-made run stopper in the NFL right now. He can come in and be really good doing that. Jeremiah thinks, unlike Jordan Davis, the big nose tackle out of Georgia who plays for the Eagles now, unlike Davis, he thinks there's actually some untapped potential where Grant can develop into a good pass rusher. So there's that potentially higher ceiling there for Grant as well. And he's supposed to test off the charts. He's supposed to come in here and be an athletic freak. So, we'll see if he, right now you see him anywhere from like 15 to 25. If he tests great, you might see him go up the draft board. So, well, like we're talking about, really, really, really strong class. And, it's going to be fun to watch these guys in Indy this week.
One thing I saw in Kenneth Grant's tape that I've seen so far, this guy doesn't give up on plays. Like you see the way that he fights, at the start of a play, but he'll fight at the end of the play the same way. I've seen him chase down guys, kind of like Cam Heyward. When the play's getting a little downfield, he's not giving up on it. He's chasing guys down successfully. So he's a freakish athlete. I agree with you. I think Kenneth Grant's been a guy that I was eyeing on, and I saw like a lot of big boards that had him in the 20s about a couple weeks ago. But more and more, as more people started to look at him, I think people were like, maybe we should move him a little bit higher. And that's before even the combine happens. So by the time the combine happens, who knows? Maybe both Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant will be top 10 picks because people just want to get it on this defensive tackle class. But if Kenneth Grant does go that high, if guys are in the top 10, I doubt the Steelers trade up to get him because they got so many other things they could need. But like you said, there's other guys like Walter Nolen at Ole Miss looks really good. I think he only did one day at the Senior Bowl and then was so good. His team was like, nope, wrap it up. You've shown everything you need to show. Derrick Harmon, like you mentioned, out of Oregon, a guy that Pitt fans should remember. Darius Alexander out of Toledo. He had that pick 6 against the Panthers in the Game Above Sports Bowl. There's Tyleik Williams out of Ohio State, who I think has some really great measurables as well. He could be another guy that tests really well. But that's the thing here, Ray. Like you said, it's not just about getting a run stuffer. If you're able to find those rare generational guys who are potential elite guys that could grow into elite run stuffers and become elite pass rushers, that's what Cam Heyward is. And when you have a guy like that and you have multiple guys like that on your defensive line, it makes you that much more dangerous. It's why the Eagles were so tough this past year, is because while they had Jordan Davis, who was just a run stuffer, they had Jalen Carter, who could do both at a high level, and then you could mix and match guys behind them. So there's potential for that, and that's why it's such an exciting group to be looking at right now.
Yeah, so for our listeners, if you're just getting into the the draft now, a guy like Walter Nolen is probably going to be a replacement for Larry Ogunjobi. A guy like Derrick Harmon is probably going to be a replacement for Cam Heyward. And it's important as we're going to write about this, we're going to explain it, but for the readers and the listeners, it's important to know the differences, right? Because the 3 technique is going to be a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit more athletic, while the 5 technique is going to be your big strapping 6'5", 300-pounder, like a Cam Heyward. And, you talked about Nolen for a little bit. And we should tell people we're going to be doing videos on all these guys on our YouTube channel. So watch for that in the coming weeks. I already did one on Walter Nolen. He likens himself to Aaron Donald, Chris. And when you watch him on tape, he's not anywhere near Aaron Donald right now, but he's quick. He shoots gaps. He's supremely athletic. So, you can see like some of the similarities there. Obviously, if he has Aaron Donald's work ethic, maybe he'll someday get to that point. But so Nolen is going to be an interesting guy. You sometimes see him go before the Steelers at 21. Harmon usually is in their range. So this could be an interesting year. Maybe it's a trade up year to get that guy that they want. Maybe it's a trade back year, and you accumulate picks, and you get multiple defensive linemen later in the draft. They are going to have their options when it comes to defensive ends and defensive tackles in this class.
options abound for the Steelers, and all those different moves most likely will be decided by Omar Khan, the Steelers GM. But let's talk about Omar Khan because he's going to talk to us on Tuesday when he gets to Indianapolis. We'll talk about that next year and what questions we're looking forward to asking him on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo, stick with us. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're injured in an accident, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, for over 40 years, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injury victims answer that very question. Whether it's gathering evidence, collecting medical records, or dealing with the insurance companies, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped over 75,000 people handle the question, what's next? Call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about Omar Khan with him set to talk to Pittsburgh media Tuesday morning. There's some interesting questions to be had right now because beyond even just the draft, the Steelers haven't made a decision openly about their quarterback situation. And that, to me, is still the big question. Now, last year when we were here at the Combine and we talked to him at the Conrad, Omar Khan made it seem as if there wasn't any questions. Kenny Pickett was the guy. He said they believed in Kenny Pickett. And then it was a week or less later where they had signed Russell Wilson. They traded Kenny Pickett away and then traded for Justin Fields. And then, the 2024 season was created with a whole new quarterback room. What are your expectations to hear from Omar Khan? How much, naturally he's going to deflect from trying to tip anything in the Steelers' hand here. But is there anything that we can learn that's going to help us get a better sense of what the Steelers are doing at quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great for us if that was, a story that we can define for our readers out there when we get out there, Chris. But I honestly don't know if that's going to be in the cards. Free agency begins March 12th. You would think they're going to want to have either Russell or Justin signed before them. You're not going to want either of those guys testing free agency. So, we're at the end of February now. I would say first week of March, we should have some news on that. So it might not happen at the Combine. And you're right. Omar is going to deflect. He's not going to want to tip his hand in any way. For people who don't know about the Indianapolis Combine, it's more than just players working out. All the agents are there. Obviously, the GMs, the owners are there. So there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work going into free agency right now. It's almost like the illegal tampering period is actually going to start this week rather than, a few days before free agency. That's just the way it works. So, yeah, Omar's going to keep it close to the vest. But for me, Chris, if I had to predict right now, I would say, people are talking about Matthew Stafford and Aaron Rodgers. I think it's going to be much more boring than that. I think it's going to be Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, and it's going to be, oh, yeah, I thought they would do that. I don't think it's going to be a big splash move like we saw last year, but obviously you got to keep the door open because Omar and Art and Mike, they all surprised us last year.
Absolutely. You got to be ready for anything in case, someone says they don't want to be around anymore. They don't want to take a deal. You can't be left out in the cold. So you got to have as many contingency plans as possible. So let's move on from quarterback, though. There's got to be a concern as far as the construction of the roster when it comes to everyone's been talking about, the Steelers have the highest paid defense. They pay the most money on defense. When will that change? I think one way that changes is if they get younger on defense. This is why, one of the reasons you're talking about drafting a defensive tackle is if you drafted a really good DT and, again, two potential guys that could start there, you can then cut Larry Ogunjobi, and that's money that you can then flip into the offense. And Ray, I think maybe one of the questions for Omar Khan is how do they find that nucleus on offense, because they've been trying for a couple years now to develop it, and maybe they are developing it. Maybe the offensive line's going to come together, and Pat Freiermuth can be part of that. But it seems to me like that's still a big question about how the future of this roster is going to unfold.
Yeah, I mean, how many more improvements can they make other than adding another receiver or two? Obviously, the quarterback is the biggest piece, but they can't really invest any more high picks into the offensive line.
Right.
They just signed Pat Freiermuth, and the situation at running back, yeah, they might bring back Najee Harris, but that's not that's going to be like 2% of your salary cap, even if they make that move. It's going to be even less if they go with Jaylen Warren and a rookie. As someone like me, that's what I would do, because this running backs class is so strong. That's one of the more curious stories of the last couple of weeks, Chris, is like why they're even considering bringing back Najee Harris. It doesn't really make sense on the surface. So that's another question for Omar this week. We'll see if we can pin him down on that. But I mean, they've already done the majority of their moves on offense, other than figuring out who's going to play quarterback and figuring out what you're going to do with George Pickens and the rest of that receivers room. Everything else is pretty much in place. And as I wrote a couple of weeks ago when I analyzed the offensive line, it's time for Broderick Jones to step up and to play better. It's time for Zach Frazier and Troy Fautano and Pat Freiermuth and all those guys to take more on their shoulders and to become a bigger part of this football team. So when I look at this roster construction, I think, the offense, I think it's like 80% done. Little tinkering here and there. Do what you got to do with Pickens, trade him or keep him. But to me, that's like the majority of that work is done. Now you have to count on those guys to make incremental improvements, each and every year. And, for a guy like Broderick Jones, a big step in 2025.
You referenced one of the other big questions I think that kind of is there for Omar Khan. All these other things to consider. George Pickens' future is a big part of this, because easily he's the most talented playmaker on the offense right now. But Ray, he's heading into the last year of his rookie deal. He's not a first rounder, so they can't do a 5th-year extension on him. He hasn't gotten an extension yet, and he didn't exactly play to the level of deserving a big money extension with the way that he finished this past season. And that's not to say that he's not talented and that the Steelers should automatically just not give him the money, but I think that there's a legitimate question right there right now. Should the Steelers invest in him and give him that long-term big money contract that you paid a number 1 wide receivers when you have questions about his discipline, about his his antics on and off the field, and you want to see more consistency from him. There's a lot of questions there, and I think one of the things that Omar Khan needs to figure out is what's the plan, because either A, you extend him and this becomes a non-story, or B, you don't extend him, you hold on to him heading into training camp, you hope that he doesn't hold in or hold out, and then you get him for the year, and then you see what you want to do after that. Maybe you figure something out at that point. But then the third option is trading him, because maybe you don't want to risk the hold in or the hold out. Maybe you don't want to risk him not signing a deal and then hitting free agency next year, and then all you're getting back is a comp pick for him. That's a big question. And I think that Omar Khan, again, he's not going to tell us what he wants to do, because I don't think he wants to necessarily, negotiate with George Pickens on, via our videos, right? But he does need to be careful with it. And I think it's going to be interesting. How does he respond to questions about him, considering that's very much up in the air?
Chris, I would be floored if they extended him this summer. I think the only 2 options are you trade him or you keep him for the last year. And like you said, you'd get a comp pick, and that would be assuming you get through the 2025 season without a lot of drama. And for anyone who watched the Steelers this year, there was plenty of drama. Brian Backo wrote about that when he analyzed the receivers over the weekend in his piece on Sunday. I mean, just a laundry list of things that went wrong for George and the Steelers this year. So if that happens, Chris, if he's extended this summer, that would be the most controversial story involving the Steelers, I think, in quite some time. I just don't see any way they can make long-term plans with a guy who doesn't show up for work on time, doesn't show up for games on time, isn't a good teammate, doesn't block in the running game, doesn't always run his routes. I mean, I can go on and on. I just don't see how they can do an extension with that guy at this time.
And then if you're not doing an extension with him, what's your plan at wide receiver? Do you draft one high? Do you draft one low? We'll talk about other strengths and weaknesses in this draft class next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, remind you this show is also brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can get your new Honda vehicle at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, PA, or visit their website at moonhonda.com. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
We gave the all-electric Prologue EX class-leading passenger space. And we made its tech intuitive with Google built-in. Perhaps that's why we were named Best Overall EV and Hybrid Brand by Kelley Blue Book. It's nice when a dream comes together. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast. Again, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. We're coming back from this break here. Ray, I want to talk about this class a little bit more because we've talked about how strong of a defensive tackle class this is. Wide receiver is another big need in my eye for the Pittsburgh Steelers, as is cornerback. To me, those are the three priorities: DT, corner, receiver. But in your eyes, looking at this draft class, is this a draft class where you could say you could find you're confident in finding those positions early or in the middle rounds? Because like we've talked about, you could probably draft a defensive tackle in the middle rounds and maybe still get a starter capable like player, but that's not always the case for every position. And I think that when you start looking around at some of these other ones, it may make it tougher to pick a DT in the first round if you're trying to get a starter capable guy in some of these other spots.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting. Let's talk about receiver first, and then we'll get to corner after that. For receivers, Jeremiah had there's only 3 receivers in his latest mock draft who go in round 1. In last year's draft, there were 3 receivers that went in the top 10.
Yeah.
So this is a good receivers class, but you don't have like the Marvin Harrison Jr. or the Rome Odunze, or Malik Neighbors.
Brian Thomas.
Yeah, you don't have those types of guys in this class. So really what you're talking about, there's the kid from Arizona who probably has potential to be a number 1 receiver. But when you start talking about guys like Golden and Ibuka, guys who are mocked to the Steelers, kind of the ceiling for them is a good, strong number 2 receiver. Probably early in their careers, more of a 3. Okay. So the Steelers have to balance out. Listen, there's nothing wrong at number 21 at getting a good number 2 who's going to be with you for, 4 or 5 and hopefully more years beyond that. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're probably not getting Santonio Holmes and that kind of a guy this year in this type of a draft. So that's the first thing. Now, if you want to wait till the second, third round, you could probably still get like a number 2 or a number 3, but you're probably taking a little bit more of a chance, right? It's kind of like roll the dice. And, there's a lot of guys who are, smaller slot type receivers, don't really have versatility, to be X's in the NFL. So you certainly have to weigh that too. So that's, we just got done talking about Pickens last segment. Do you need that potential future, X receiver who's going to go down the field? Yeah, you probably are going to want that guy in this draft. So that's kind of how I see this unfolding. There are guys you can certainly get in the second, third round who might develop into that. But, if you want to have a better shot at one, you might have to sacrifice a DT in the first round, get that guy, get that receiver in the first round, then address DT second, third, fourth round.
No, I'm right with you there. Like, I feel like there's tough questions because at wide receiver you have guys like, do you want to wait in the second round and then you're drafting Jaden Higgins as your receiver? Do you want to wait to the third round and then you're going to be talking about guys? And the other thing about this is there's only so many guys in this draft class as far as wide receivers who are outside receivers, because the Steelers, I feel like they've got the slot guys, they've got the small shifty guys, Roman Wilson, Calvin Austin. You just hope one of those guys works out for the long term, or both of them, who knows. But if you're thinking of moving George Pickens or not having George Pickens after this season at all, Ray, I feel like you have to go get an outside guy, and it might also mean that you need to get an outside guy paired with getting another one in free agency. And so that's where you need to look at some of those receivers. Some people wonder, can Emeka Egbuka, is he more of a big slot in the NFL than he is a split end or a flanker? Can Matthew Golden fill that role? Is Jack Bech that role from TCU? Jaden Higgins definitely is that. Savion Williams you can put out there with their size, but that's part of the question here at receiver. And I think after that second round, you start to get into some really shaky territory with guys who could just jump into that category, and that's why I'm looking at receiver a lot in the second round for the Steelers. But, cornerback's another need. They need to figure out what they're doing across from Joey Porter Jr. I have a feeling, Ray, and this is another question I'll have for Omar Khan, but I feel like the cornerback free agency class has a potential to be really opportunistic for the Steelers. Asante Samuel looks like he might go to free agency. Byron Murphy looks like he might go to free agency. If you were to add one or both of those guys and then maybe another solid veteran, you might make it so that corner is the thing you can spare in this draft class, where you can say, you know what, you've got Porter, you've got Trice, you've got Bishop. Those are your three young guys. Let's sign some older guys to these positions. And then that way you can get younger at DT, wide receiver, and then maybe you double up on one of those positions in this early round, or you spend that third round pick at running back, where you're talking about where Najee Harris, if he's not back, where you could get some help there.
Yeah, and let's face it, if you're going to wait until the third round to get a corner, let's say they do go out and get a guy like Byron Murphy in free agency, then third round, fourth round, that's a great place to find a slot. And you would need a slot to compete with Beanie Bishop. You wouldn't want to just hand Beanie Bishop a starting job. So that would be an ideal scenario, if they could do something like that. So I would be all on board for that. And I don't think corners, if you get the best corner in free agency, you're probably going to spend upwards of 20. But to me, I think defensive tackles are going to go off the board sooner, and I think they're going to be more expensive. And, just looking at the history of how some of these free agent corners haven't worked out, I think their market price might, be pushed down a little bit. So that's not a bad plan at all. And I think we mentioned this last week, Chris. Traditionally, the Steelers get their starting corners, Joey Porter, the outlier, but they get them via trade. They get them via free agency. Dante Jackson came in a trade, Akella Witherspoon before him. It's not a position, at least under Kevin Colbert, it's not a position that they really drafted great, like in his last 20 years or so. They always were having to, go find guys in free agency or trade. So we'll see if that's any different with Omar and Andy. Maybe it will be. They did invest that number 32 pick in Joey. Maybe they feel like they got a better feel for it. But traditionally, that's a position they have addressed with trades and free agency.
Absolutely. There's a lot to cover, a lot to discuss. You can get all of that coverage here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Reminder, you can subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com. Read all of our work there and get all of our shows here on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We'll be back with you very soon here in Indianapolis, where the NFL Combine it starts this week, and we'll have coverage all week long here from Indy. We'll see you here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.